Numbers, Congresswoman, do not have a religion. That was the sentence Ted Cruz delivered directly to Ilhan Omar in a hearing room packed with cameras, staffers, reporters, and people who had clearly arrived expecting political theater, but instead found themselves watching something colder, more methodical, and far harder to dismiss. By the time Cruz reached that line, he had already dragged nearly $30 million in disputed financial disclosure figures onto the table, raised roughly $3 million in campaign payments connected to Omar's husband, and pointed toward federal and state statutes that, according to the argument being presented, could carry severe criminal penalties if the underlying allegations were ever proven. Omar came prepared with four defenses: the familiar mixture of correction, explanation, dismissal, and identity based counterattack that had worked repeatedly in public arguments where emotion could outrun arithmetic and accusation could be turned back on the accuser. Cruz's strategy was simpler, almost brutally so. Strip away the biography, strip away the slogans, strip away the political insulation, and keep returning to the numbers until the numbers themselves became impossible to ignore. The scene looked almost ordinary at first, which made what followed more effective because there was no theatrical explosion announcing the confrontation before it began. Cruz had a thick manila folder sitting in front of him, divided into color-coded sections: blue, red, yellow, and green, with his reading glasses resting across the top as if this were less a political ambush than an audit waiting to be opened in sequence. Omar sat across from him with 17 pages of prepared remarks and a chief of staff carrying a leather binder, the kind of visual armor politicians bring into hearings when they expect a hostile room and want every possible answer close at hand. She looked toward the cameras when she entered, not toward Cruz, and that detail mattered because from the beginning, this was not simply about answering a senator's questions. It was about controlling the image of who was being questioned and why. Cruz understood that, and instead of fighting for the first headline, he let Omar have the opening stage entirely. He began quietly, thanking her for appearing and then offering her something politicians rarely receive from an opponent who has spent weeks preparing a case against them: uninterrupted space to explain herself. Omar took the invitation and delivered the defense that had protected her in countless public controversies, beginning with her arrival in America as a refugee, her childhood, her struggle to learn English, her rise into elected office, the threats she had received, and what she described as extraordinary scrutiny directed at her. She argued that the accusations followed a familiar pattern, with conservative media generating a story, Republican politicians amplifying it, and the target once again becoming a black Muslim immigrant woman whose identity made her uniquely vulnerable to political attacks. The emotional structure was obvious and effective because it shifted the hearing away from spreadsheets and disclosures and toward a much larger moral argument about prejudice, belonging, power, and who gets the benefit of the doubt in American politics. Cruz did not interrupt, did not roll his eyes, did not rush to contradict her, and instead wrote 2 words on his legal pad while allowing the entire defense to fully establish itself before touching the first tab. When Omar finished, Cruz thanked her and focused immediately on one word she had chosen to describe her conduct: transparent. That was the hinge, because once Omar claimed transparency, Cruz no longer needed to argue about motives, media bias, ideology, race, religion, or whether she had been unfairly targeted. He only needed to compare that claim with the documents carrying her name. He opened the blue tab and produced her 2024 financial disclosure, a document filed under penalty of perjury that, according to the figures presented in the hearing, placed the combined assets of Omar and her husband somewhere between roughly $6 million and $30 million. Then came the amended disclosure, filed several months later, which reportedly placed those assets in a dramatically different range, approximately $18,000 to $95,000, turning what had looked like substantial wealth on one filing into comparatively modest assets on another. 2 filings one name, one household, and a gap so enormous that calling it a routine correction immediately sounded less like an answer than the beginning of another question. Cruz narrowed the issue further by focusing on the specific businesses connected to Omar's husband, including a winery initially listed within a $1 million range and a venture capital firm reportedly listed between $5 million and $25 million, before both effectively disappeared from the amended picture. This was not a normal market fluctuation, not a disappointing quarter, not a bad investment losing 20% while accountants adjusted the valuation, because the difference being presented was essentially between substantial reported value and virtually nothing. Omar responded that the earlier filing contained errors and that accountants had provided incomplete information, particularly by listing assets without properly accounting for liabilities. Cruz seized on that explanation because if liabilities were the reason tens of millions in apparent value vanished, then the natural question became whether those companies had liabilities large enough to erase tens of millions of dollars in reported assets. Omar did not provide a direct numerical answer to that question, and the silence created exactly the opening Cruz had been building toward from the moment she used the word transparent. He then reduced the entire dispute to the kind of comparison ordinary Americans instantly understand. If a taxpayer told the IRS he was worth tens of millions of dollars and returned 4 months later claiming he was worth less than 100,000, government investigators would not simply stamp the second form and congratulate him for correcting an innocent clerical mistake. They would want records, statements, valuations, debt schedules, transaction histories, and an explanation for how tens of millions of dollars appeared on one sworn filing and disappeared from the next. Cruz's argument was deliberately unforgiving. Either the assets existed and something happened to them, or they did not exist, and the original disclosure was badly wrong, but merely replacing one number with another did not explain which reality was true. Omar said the filing had been corrected and the issue had been addressed, a word that would soon become almost more important than the numbers themselves, because Cruz recognized it as a shield rather than an explanation. He wrote "addressed" on his legal pad, emphasizing that a correction changes the record while an explanation tells the committee why the record had to be changed in the first place. That distinction was devastatingly simple, because Omar's position depended on treating amendment as closure, while Cruz insisted that amendment was merely evidence that the original filing demanded scrutiny. The minimum gap cited in the exchange approached $29 million, a figure large enough that no serious investigator could reasonably treat it like a typo in a checking account balance or a misplaced decimal point on a tax worksheet. Cruz did not need to accuse her of personally pocketing the difference, and he did not need to invent a destination for the missing value, because the inconsistency itself was enough to keep the question alive. The harder Omar leaned on the idea that the matter had already been handled, the more Cruz focused on the fact that handled and explained are not interchangeable terms, especially when sworn financial disclosures are involved. Then, without giving the room time to settle, he moved from the blue tab to the red one. The red tab concerned campaign money, specifically roughly $3 million that Omar's campaign reportedly paid during the 2020 election cycle to the E Street Group, a consulting firm co-owned by her husband, Tim Minette. Cruz highlighted the scale rather than merely the existence of the payments, arguing that nearly half of the campaign's spending during certain periods flowed toward a company tied directly to Omar's spouse, including one quarter in which roughly $228,000 out of approximately $521,000 in spending reportedly went to that firm. Omar defended the payments by saying the company provided extensive campaign services, including consulting, fundraising, digital advertising, travel coordination, and other operational work that campaigns routinely outsource. Cruz's counter was not that political consultants should work for campaigns, but that comparable services were later obtained from other vendors for far less money. creating an obvious question about whether the original arrangement was unusually expensive. Once again, the argument did not depend on a dramatic accusation because arithmetic was doing most of the damage. Cruz pressed on the price difference, contrasting approximately $3 million in payments to the husband-linked firm with what he described as roughly $1 million for similar services after other firms took over the work. Omar replied that different companies charge different rates, which is true in the abstract but far less persuasive when the price gap being discussed is measured not in 10 or 20%, but in multiples. Cruz then referenced public divorce filings involving Tim Mynette's former wife, who had alleged that his time and relationship with Omar extended beyond professional campaign work, a point Omar dismissed by emphasizing the adversarial nature of divorce proceedings. Cruz refused to let the hearing become a debate over the emotional credibility of a divorce filing and returned instead to the part that could not be dismissed as marital bitterness. The campaign payments themselves were public records. His message was blunt without needing theatrics, because when a campaign pays millions to a spouse-linked company and comparable work later appears to cost dramatically less, asking what justified the difference is not persecution. It is the minimum level of scrutiny political money should receive. Omar answered that her campaign finances had been reviewed, that there had been no finding of wrongdoing, that the arrangement was legal, disclosed, and once again addressed. Cruz wrote the same word on his legal pad again, drawing a line back to the first use as if he were documenting a recurring defense pattern rather than merely recording testimony. He argued that the Federal Election Commission had been unable to act normally for a significant period because it lacked the commissioners required for a quorum, meaning institutional paralysis could not automatically be presented as an affirmative declaration of innocence. That distinction sharpened the entire exchange because the absence of enforcement is not necessarily the same thing as a factual finding that every questioned transaction was proper, just as a locked courthouse does not magically transform every unresolved dispute into vindication. And then Cruz delivered the point that pushed the hearing into its next phase. Omar was correct that her situation was unusual, but in his framing it was unusual not because of who she was, but because very few members of Congress had ever placed a nearly $30 million discrepancy and millions in spouse-linked campaign payments on the same table at the same time. That was the moment Omar stopped playing defense and decided to attack the frame itself, because answering one number after another was clearly becoming a losing proposition, and the only remaining move was to challenge the legitimacy of the questioning. She straightened, leaned toward the microphone, and argued that every question followed the same pattern: find a Muslim woman, locate a discrepancy, inflate it into a conspiracy, then pretend the scrutiny is neutral while the target is anything but neutral. She returned to the biography that had carried enormous political weight for years, reminding the room that she had arrived in the United States as a refugee child, built a life from almost nothing, entered politics, won office, and then endured a level of examination she insisted other members of Congress did not face. This time, the argument landed differently because she was no longer merely explaining herself. She was accusing the entire process of being selective, discriminatory, and designed to punish someone for looking, praying, and coming from somewhere different. And for a few seconds, it worked. The room shifted toward her because Omar moved the question from what she had done to whether she was being treated fairly, and fairness is always more emotionally powerful than an accounting spreadsheet when cameras are running. She challenged the room to examine senators whose spouses serve on corporate boards, children who obtain lucrative positions around influential industries, and lawmakers whose investments somehow move alongside information unavailable to ordinary voters. The implication was sharp. If political families across Washington profit from proximity to power, why was this particular member of Congress being placed under a microscope while others received polite silence? A young woman in the gallery nodded, a reporter stopped writing, and even people who had been following Cruz's arithmetic were suddenly forced to consider whether the questioning had crossed from accountability into targeting. For the first time that morning, Cruz was in danger of losing the room, not because the numbers had changed, but because Omar had changed the subject successfully. Cruz did not interrupt her, and that restraint mattered more than another aggressive question would have, because interrupting would have confirmed exactly the picture Omar was painting. He let the silence sit for several seconds, removed his glasses, and acknowledged that being the first person from a particular background to occupy a position can bring pressures other people do not experience. He did not dispute the difficulty of her personal history, and he did not deny her right to defend herself, because he understood that attacking those points would only strengthen her argument. Then he drew a line between identity and conduct, and accused Omar of collapsing the two whenever the conduct became uncomfortable to discuss. His point was devastatingly precise. If every hard question about money, disclosures, relationships, or campaign spending can be converted into an attack on race, religion, gender, or immigration history, then accountability becomes practically impossible. He reopened the folder and moved to the yellow tab, signaling that the identity argument had not made the evidence disappear and had not changed the obligation to answer what was sitting on the desk. Cruz made clear that he was not asking questions because Omar was Muslim, Somali, female, or an immigrant, but because the numbers and documents being discussed contained inconsistencies that demanded explanation. Then came the sentence that captured his entire strategy in a form almost too simple to rebut. Numbers, Congresswoman, do not have a religion. The line worked because it did not deny prejudice exists, did not deny Omar's biography, and did not demand that the room choose between respecting her background and scrutinizing her record. It simply returned the hearing to the place Omar had tried to leave. The figures still existed, the filing still existed, the payment still existed, and none of them changed meaning based on the identity of the person whose name appeared beside them. With the room pulled back toward the documents, Cruz moved into the yellow and green sections, where the accusations became more serious, and the margin for rhetorical escape narrowed quickly. He raised the name Ahmed Nur Said Elmi and immediately encountered Omar's long-standing response that the allegation surrounding that marriage was a smear. Cruz did not attempt to prove the entire allegation through rhetoric, and instead asked the question that made dismissal harder. If Elmi was not her brother, would she provide documentation to the committee establishing that fact? Omar did not supply the kind of immediate documentary answer Cruz was asking for, and the resulting silence carried more force than another round of accusations because it exposed the difference between rejecting a claim and producing evidence that resolves it. Cruz then carefully separated admiration for Omar's refugee story from legal accountability, arguing that whatever one thinks of the remarkable journey from war-torn Somalia to the United States Congress, biography cannot function as an exemption from statutes. He laid out the timeline presented in the original case. Omar married Ahmed Nur Said Elmi in 2009, while, according to the account being discussed, she was also connected to Ahmed Abdisalan Hirsi, the father of her children, later divorcing Elmi and eventually marrying Hirsi. Cruz emphasized that the allegation had moved beyond blogs and partisan commentary because prominent administration officials and federal investigators had publicly discussed reviewing relevant records, though an investigation is not the same thing as proof of guilt. That distinction did not soften his presentation because his purpose was to show that calling the issue a smear could not substitute for addressing the legal questions if investigators believed those questions were serious enough to examine. He then began citing the statutes that could become relevant if the underlying allegations were ever established, turning a politically radioactive controversy into a list of concrete legal exposure rather than a shouting match about motive. The first was federal marriage fraud under Title 8, Section 1325C, which criminalizes knowingly entering a marriage for the purpose of evading immigration laws and carries potential imprisonment and fines. Then Cruz added Minnesota law concerning marriage to a biological sibling, presenting a possible state felony carrying a substantial prison sentence if the alleged relationship were proven. He followed with federal tax law, referencing potential exposure under Title 26, Section 7206, if fraudulent tax filings were connected to a marriage arrangement that itself was unlawful. His calculation combined those theoretical maximum penalties into 18 years, not as a declaration that Omar had been convicted of anything, but as a demonstration of how serious the legal framework could become if prosecutors established the underlying facts. That distinction was crucial because the hearing's power came from juxtaposing Omar's repeated use of words like smear and sick with statutes whose language does not care about political branding. Cruz's message was that accusations can certainly be false, but if they are false, they are defeated with facts, while simply insulting the accusation does nothing to erase the law that would apply if the accusation were true. Omar again rejected the marriage allegation and characterized it as a disgusting smear, but Cruz refused to spend another minute debating adjectives. He answered with the basic proposition that sick is not a legal defense, and smear is not an answer to a statute, because the relevant question is whether the conduct occurred, not whether the allegation is offensive to hear. If the allegation was false, the statute did not apply. If it was true, the statute could apply, and no amount of political outrage could change that binary structure. That was exactly the kind of terrain Cruz wanted, because moral language is flexible while statutory language is deliberately rigid, and once the hearing reached that terrain, Omar's strongest rhetorical defense became far less useful. But the yellow tab was only part of what remained, because Cruz then turned toward a number so large and a subject so politically toxic that every previous dispute over disclosures and campaign consulting suddenly looked small by comparison. $250 million was the figure he placed into the record next, tied to fraud involving a federal child nutrition program created to feed vulnerable children during the pandemic. Cruz slowed the pace because this argument did not depend merely on technical paperwork or financial valuation. It depended on reminding the room what the money was supposed to purchase before describing where prosecutors alleged enormous portions of it actually went. The program existed to provide meals to children whose schools were closed, whose parents were struggling, and whose families depended on public assistance during a national emergency, making every stolen dollar more than a bookkeeping loss. Cruz described the intended reality in ordinary terms: school meals, lunch trays, milk cartons, children waiting for food, because $250 million is an abstraction until the audience understands what that money was meant to do. And once that picture was established, he was ready to contrast it with Teslas, luxury cars, foreign property, expensive apartments, and a fraud scandal that had already produced dozens of criminal cases in Minnesota. Cruz's next move was to make the fraud allegations impossible to hear as abstract Washington accounting, because $250 million sounds like a number until somebody forces the room to imagine what that money was supposed to buy. He described children waiting for school meals during the pandemic, families whose incomes had collapsed, cafeterias and community centers functioning as lifelines, and public funds intended to keep those children fed when almost everything else in their lives had become uncertain. Then he contrasted that purpose with what federal prosecutors had alleged the stolen money financed, including luxury vehicles, expensive property, overseas real estate, and lifestyles that had nothing whatsoever to do with feeding children. The moral force of the argument came from the distance between the intended beneficiary and the alleged beneficiary, between a child waiting for lunch and an adult allegedly converting program money into private wealth. Cruz did not need to raise his voice because once the audience understood that contrast, volume would only have weakened it. He cited the scale of the prosecutions connected to the Minnesota fraud investigation, pointing to dozens of defendants and convictions, and emphasizing that many of the people charged came from Omar's congressional district and the surrounding Somali American community. The point was not that ethnicity itself established guilt, and Cruz's argument depended on avoiding that trap, but that such a large fraud operation unfolding in the political territory Omar represented deserved direct questions rather than reflexive dismissal. He referenced statements from federal prosecutors suggesting that the total scope of public program fraud in Minnesota could exceed $1 billion, a figure large enough to transform the issue from a local embarrassment into a national scandal. Against that backdrop, he brought up Omar's sister, Sarah Noor, and Grit Partners, a consulting company the source script connected to an address associated with individuals tied to convicted defendants, while also noting claims that the firm had helped secure tens of millions in funding. The implication was unmistakable, but the legal reality still required separation between association and proof, and Cruz's purpose was to demand documents that could either clarify the relationship or leave the questions hanging. He then returned to what he presented as one of the most frustrating patterns in the entire hearing. Documents were requested, explanations were demanded, and yet every uncomfortable line of inquiry seemed to encounter the same political barricade. Cruz argued that Minnesota Democrats had blocked a subpoena seeking records connected to Omar's office, and emphasized that in the version of events he was presenting, not a single responsive document had been provided to settle the matter. To him, that was not exoneration, and it certainly was not transparency. It was another unanswered door in a hallway already crowded with them. Omar's defense continued to rely on the claim that these matters were politically manufactured attacks, but Cruz kept dragging the conversation back from motive to substance, from who was asking the question to whether the question had actually been answered. By this point, the hearing had become less about any single allegation than about whether repetition of the word smear could substitute for evidence indefinitely. Then Cruz shifted from money to rhetoric, and the first phrase he chose was one Omar's critics had repeated for years. Her 2019 description of the September 11th attacks using the words, "Some people did something." He treated those 4 words as evidence of a broader pattern of minimizing events that millions of Americans experienced not as abstractions, but as personal memory, national trauma, and the defining catastrophe of a generation. The people in the gallery did not need an explanation of what September 11th meant, because most of them remembered exactly where they were, what they saw, and how the country felt afterward. Cruz's argument was not merely that Omar had chosen clumsy language, but that public officials carry a responsibility to understand the moral weight of the events they describe, especially when those events involve nearly 3,000 murdered Americans. Once again, the force came from contrast, the enormity of the event on one side and the smallness of the phrase on the other. From there, he moved to Omar's past comments about Israel, including her statement that Israel had hypnotized the world, and her remark that political support for Israel was all about the Benjamins. Cruz characterized those comments as invoking long-standing anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish money and political influence, and he tied them to criticism Omar had already faced inside Congress, rather than presenting them as accusations invented for the hearing. He also referenced her comparison involving the United States, Israel, Hamas, and the Taliban, arguing that the accumulated record showed a pattern of rhetoric far more serious than a single badly phrased tweet or stray comment. The point was cumulative because Cruz was constructing a record in which every individual controversy might be dismissed in isolation but became more difficult to wave away when placed side by side. Omar had spent years arguing that critics deliberately stripped her words of context, while Cruz was arguing that the context was precisely what made the repeated pattern impossible to ignore. The hearing then moved into policing, another subject where Omar's rhetoric had generated enormous controversy in Minneapolis. Cruz cited her description of the Minneapolis Police Department as a cancer and her support for dismantling the existing department, then contrasted that position with the later defeat of a police restructuring ballot proposal by local voters. He brought up the loss of officers, rising crime indicators cited in the source script, and the argument that residents ultimately bore the cost when slogans collided with the practical reality of violent crime, theft, and carjackings. Then he sharpened the hypocrisy charge by pointing to campaign spending on private security, reducing the contradiction to a line any voter could understand. Less police protection for ordinary citizens, while political figures still had access to protection of their own. That was the kind of contrast Cruz preferred because it required no ideological theory, only a comparison between what leaders demanded for the public and what they purchased for themselves. By now, the room had stopped drifting between sympathy and suspicion because Cruz had changed the rhythm from long accusations to short factual collisions, each one forcing Omar back toward the same defensive vocabulary. Financial disclosures were called addressed. Campaign spending was called addressed. The marriage allegation was called a smear. The fraud questions were treated as smears. And criticism of her past rhetoric was repeatedly framed as another example of political targeting. Cruz seized on that repetition because a defense becomes weaker when it is used for every category of accusation, regardless of whether the underlying subject is money, law, campaign finance, marriage records, federal prosecutions, policing, or foreign policy. His argument was that one word could not plausibly answer every question, because questions this different required answers equally specific. The more Omar leaned on the language of persecution, the more Cruz portrayed that language as a substitute for the documentary explanation he had been asking for since the Blue Tab. Omar finally called the hearing a disgusting spectacle, but by then the phrase landed with less force than it would have an hour earlier because Cruz had spent too long building a record around specific numbers and documents. He did not respond with outrage, and he did not celebrate the weakness of her answer because his entire advantage depended on appearing less emotional than the person across the table. He simply returned to the proposition underneath the entire hearing: calling an allegation a smear does not make it false, just as calling an investigation persecution does not make the underlying question disappear. The answer to bad evidence is better evidence. The answer to a false claim is documentation, and the answer to an inaccurate number is a clear account of how it became inaccurate and what the correct number actually represents. By refusing to provide that level of specificity in the exchange as presented, Omar allowed Cruz to frame every repeated dismissal not as resolution, but as another admission that the question remained open. Then came the small visual moment the cameras captured more effectively than any speech. Omar reached for her water glass, lifted it, realized it was empty, and set it down with deliberate care. Her 17-page prepared statement still sat in front of her, but she had barely touched it for much of the confrontation because the hearing had moved far beyond the safe territory of prepared remarks. Cruz closed the folder one section at a time, blue, red, yellow, green, and placed his glasses back on top, returning physically to almost the exact posture he had held before the questioning began. Nothing dramatic had changed in his body language, yet the atmosphere in the room was completely different because the hearing had moved from Omar's opening claim of transparency to a long sequence of disputes over what that word actually meant. And now Cruz was ready to step back from the individual allegations and make the broader argument that would define the final section of the confrontation. Cruz looked across the table and finally widened the frame, moving away from individual disclosures, campaign invoices, marriage questions, criminal statutes, fraud allegations, policing controversies, and years of public statements to the larger issue he believed connected every one of them. He reminded Omar that she had opened the hearing by insisting that the scrutiny surrounding her was fundamentally about who she was rather than what she had done, and he argued that the previous 2 hours had demonstrated exactly the opposite. The documents were not asking about her religion, the numbers were not asking about her ethnicity, the statutes were not asking where she was born, and the campaign payments were not interested in whether her biography inspired sympathy or suspicion. What mattered, in Cruz's framing, was whether an elected official could account for the money, filings, relationships, and decisions attached to her public office without converting every uncomfortable question into an accusation against the person asking it. That was the point he had been building toward from the first blue tab, and now there was no reason to hide it behind another technical exchange. He returned to the financial disclosures first because they had become the cleanest symbol of the problem. One filing reportedly showed assets that could reach tens of millions of dollars, while an amended filing reduced the picture to a tiny fraction of that amount. Omar had said the matter was corrected, but Cruz insisted correction was not explanation, and that distinction remained unresolved no matter how many times the word addressed appeared in the record. He returned to the campaign spending, where millions had gone to a company tied to her husband, while later vendors allegedly provided comparable work for far less. And again he argued that disclosure alone did not automatically make the underlying arrangement persuasive. He returned to the marriage controversy, emphasizing that denial and insult were not the same thing as documentary resolution, particularly once officials had publicly discussed investigations and applicable statutes. Then he returned to the fraud scandal in Minnesota, where enormous sums intended for children had allegedly been stolen, while questions about political connections and requested records remained politically explosive. The pattern Cruz wanted the room to see was not that every allegation had already been proven, because the source script itself did not establish that, but that Omar repeatedly answered different categories of scrutiny with the same small collection of defenses. Addressed appeared when the subject was financial disclosure. Smear appeared when the subject was marriage. Targeting appeared when the subject was political scrutiny. And outrage appeared when the cumulative record became too large to dismiss one controversy at a time. Cruz's critique was that a serious public official cannot answer specific evidence with generalized indignation forever, because accountability requires the kind of detail that slogans are designed to avoid. If a number is wrong, explain why it was wrong. If a payment was justified, explain the value received. If an allegation is false, produce the documents that establish its falsity. If a relationship is being mischaracterized, provide the records that clarify it. That is not a standard invented for Ilhan Omar, Cruz argued, but the basic price of holding federal office in a system where the public is supposed to know what its representatives are doing. He then turned Omar's own biography back toward the argument, not to diminish it, but to insist that it could not function as a permanent exemption from scrutiny. America had accepted her as a refugee, granted her citizenship, allowed her to build a political career, and ultimately placed her in one of the most powerful legislative institutions in the world, a journey that Cruz acknowledged as extraordinary. But the power of that story, in his view, made accountability more important rather than less important, because elected office is not a reward for biography. It is a public trust governed by rules that apply after the inspirational speech ends. A member of Congress receives a salary, staff, access, authority, committee power, national attention, and the ability to shape law, and in exchange, that member accepts questions about finances, conduct, judgment, and public statements. The contract does not disappear because the questions are uncomfortable, and it does not become discriminatory simply because the person answering them comes from a historically marginalized background. Cruz looked again at the legal pad where the word addressed had been written repeatedly, lines connecting each use as though he had been diagramming a defense strategy rather than taking notes. His conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. Omar had addressed everything and explained nothing, at least in the record as he chose to frame it. That sentence worked because it compressed 2 hours of confrontation into the difference between public relations language and substantive accountability, between declaring a controversy closed and actually demonstrating why it should be closed. Omar's prepared statement remained on the table, 17 pages that had once represented control, preparation, and the ability to steer the hearing toward a familiar narrative about persecution and political hostility. By the end, Cruz had reframed those pages as irrelevant to the specific questions he believed still required answers, because prepared rhetoric cannot make a financial discrepancy disappear, cannot lower a campaign invoice, cannot rewrite a statute, and cannot produce a document that has not been produced. From there, the argument became broader than Omar, and that was exactly where the source script wanted the confrontation to land. Cruz's case was that modern politics has created an incentive structure in which identity can become a defensive wall, allowing elected officials to respond to scrutiny not by disproving the criticism, but by raising the reputational cost of asking the question. If a critic can be labeled racist, anti-Muslim, misogynistic, xenophobic, or otherwise hateful before the evidence is discussed, many institutions will simply avoid the confrontation because defending themselves becomes more exhausting than investigating the original issue. The script framed Omar as an example of that phenomenon, and it connected her defense to similar arguments made by allies who emphasized attacks on women of color or marginalized representatives rather than directly addressing each allegation on its own factual terms. In that framing, the tactic does not need to prove innocence because its purpose is to make scrutiny socially expensive enough that fewer people are willing to continue it. That was why the hearing, according to the script's final argument, was presented as something larger than a clash between Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar. It was a test of whether ordinary standards of political accountability still survive when the person being questioned can credibly invoke a history of prejudice, discrimination, and unequal treatment. Cruz's answer was that those histories are real but irrelevant to the accuracy of a financial disclosure, the price of a campaign contract, the application of a criminal statute, or the existence of a public record. A number does not become racist because it embarrasses a politician. A subpoena does not acquire a religion because the recipient is Muslim, and an audit does not become xenophobic because the person being audited was born somewhere else. The standard must remain attached to conduct, because once identity changes the standard, public accountability becomes a privilege applied selectively rather than a rule applied consistently. The source script pushed that point even harder by arguing that Americans do not owe elected officials silence, deference, or protection from embarrassment simply because those officials have compelling personal histories. They owe them scrutiny precisely because public office concentrates power, and power without scrutiny becomes almost impossible to distinguish from entitlement. Every dollar attached to a campaign, every disclosure filed under penalty of perjury, every vote, every public statement, every relationship intersecting with official power, and every response to an investigation becomes legitimate territory for questioning. That does not mean every allegation is true, but it does mean every allegation supported by actual evidence deserves something more substantial than a label. Smear can describe a lie, but it cannot prove something is a lie, and persecution can describe abuse, but it cannot substitute for the documents that would show the underlying accusation is false. By the end, Cruz's method mattered as much as the content because he never needed to transform the hearing into a shouting contest to make the confrontation feel severe. He relied on folders, filings, statutes, public records, numbers, and the deliberate repetition of questions Omar, in the source script's telling, never answered to his satisfaction. He did not need to tell the gallery how to feel because the structure of the argument invited them to compare the claim of transparency with the unresolved discrepancies placed beside it. He did not need to erase Omar's biography because his entire point was that biography and accountability can coexist, and that treating them as mutually exclusive protects politicians rather than citizens. The strength of the final argument came from refusing to accept the premise that demanding answers from a Muslim immigrant woman is automatically an attack on Muslim immigrants or women. And that is where the script leaves the larger political accusation. Identity becomes dangerous when it stops being part of a person's story and starts functioning as a shield against ordinary standards applied to everyone else. Omar's defenders could argue that the scrutiny was selective, excessive, or politically motivated, but Cruz's counter throughout the hearing was that motive does not erase evidence and political hostility does not make a document inaccurate. If a critic hates you and still produces a valid record, the record remains valid. If an ally admires you and cannot explain the discrepancy, admiration does not repair it. The question is not whether Ted Cruz likes Ilhan Omar, whether Ilhan Omar trusts Ted Cruz, or whether either side believes the other is acting in good faith. The question, stripped of everything else, is whether the person holding public power can account for what appears under her name. That was the final principle the hearing was designed to leave behind after the camera stopped moving and the folder was closed. Truth does not care about biography, party affiliation, religion, race, gender, immigration history, applause, outrage, viral clips, sympathetic interviews, hostile interviews, or how many times a politician insists the question itself is offensive. It cares about whether the numbers reconcile, whether the documents support the explanation, whether the law applies, and whether the official entrusted with power can answer plainly when the record becomes uncomfortable. Cruz's final case was not that identity never matters in American politics, but that identity cannot be permitted to rewrite factual standards whenever those standards threaten someone politically. And in the version of the confrontation presented by the source script, after 2 hours and 11 minutes of questions, Ilhan Omar had not produced enough specific answers to make those questions disappear.